This is part 4 of Liberty, Democracy, and the Growth of the State. Here we enter the revolutionary period, which is familiar territory to most of us in comparison to earlier phases. And for that reason, I'll be able to leave some parts of the story out since everyone knows them. And this is fine because most of these aspects of the story fall under the category of history of ideals and aspirations that I mentioned earlier, and that don't really interest me. What I'm concerned with is not what the revolutionaries preached, but what actually came of their preaching. So let's begin by going directly to the subject of conscription. Up to this point, power has always had to appeal to its subordinates in order to get them to fight. It couldn't force them, or at least could only command in fealty a relatively small number of the people who happened to fall directly under its immediate jurisdiction. Power's greatest victory, then, was not conscription until now, but taxation, which allowed it to pay for its extensive campaigns. The revolutionaries overthrew all that. Remember how I said that in wars fought for liberty, liberty can become the first casualty? Well, let's look at some of the statements of the French revolutionaries taken from the National Convention of 1793. They said, "From this moment until such time as its enemies shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. The young men shall fight, the married men shall forge arms and transport provisions, the women shall make tents and clothes and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old lint into linen. The old men shall betake themselves to the public squares in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the republic." That's an incredible leap, perhaps more incredible than the power to tax achieved in the last phase, since it not only allows power to reach into pocketbooks, but allows it to appropriate bodies, and not only the bodies of adult males, but of everyone. Here no one escapes, not women, not children, not the aged. All in the name, ironically, of liberty. Turning to the American revolutionaries, we do see a distinction. They were more prudent in this regard, as we can see from Thomas Jefferson, when he said, "In this country conscription never was the most unpopular and impracticable thing that could be attempted. Our people, even under the monarchical government, had learnt to consider it as the last of all impressions." So according to Jefferson, conscription, or the draft, was, to the American people, the last of all oppressions. Keep that phrase in mind as we move forward. And what about taxation? Here things took another unique turn thanks to the economic innovations of the time. Keep in mind this was the period during which capitalism and modern banking methods were developed, which meant the establishment of credit-based economies. Now, real wealth was not necessarily required in order to become powerful. Credit was power, and he who had the most credit commanded the most power, at least from an economic standpoint. You might wonder what this has to do with taxation. Well, credit-based economies meant that we would begin to see the increase of what we know as national debt. The ability to accumulate massive national debts meant that power was no longer limited to the resources of the present. National debts are a tax drawn on future generations, your children and grandchildren. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain plunged itself into debt trying to stay ahead. Public expenditures in European states went from £170 million in 1816 to £868 million in 1898. That's an increase of 5 times. These developments, which seem on the surface like irresponsible economic behaviors, which are bad but not horrible, led to far more severe consequences in the way wars were waged. First, we entered the age of total war. As Edmund Burke put it, "The state is all in all. Everything is referred to the production of force. It is military in its principle, in its maxims, in its spirit, and in all its movements. Were France but half of what it is in population, in compactness, in applicability of its force, it would be too strong for most of the states of Europe." Also, the art of tactics gave way to victory by overwhelming numbers. This was a victory of quantity over quality. It represents a shocking disregard for the value of soldiers, as troops were routinely exposed in serried columns and were killed by the column. This is the era of cannon fodder. Now that the draft was underway, Napoleon could take in classes by an indefinite term. And in 1794, there were 1,169,000 men on the French register. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there were between 3 million and 6 million dead. This also led to the principle of escalation. As it was put by a Prussian general, the revolution has deployed in its entirety the national strength of the French people. The other European states must draw on the same reserves with a view to restoring the ancient balance of Europe. So these are the fruits of the revolutionary period, the victory of liberty against tyranny. It's difficult to see, though, in what way liberty won. We haven't mentioned the developments of law during this period, and that's because the next phase in the development of power carried on these same developments, and so we can discuss them in the next video, which is called The Age of Democracy, and deals with the modern era.